All right, these slides, they cover the hereditary and the environment and the interaction between the two, essentially nature and nurture. So behavior genetics, it's a field that seeks to discover the influence of heredity and environment on individual differences in human traits and in development. So when heredity and the environment interact, how does heredity influence the environment and vice versa? To study the influence of heredity on behavior, behavior geneticists often use either twin studies or adoption studies. With twin studies, the behavioral similarity of identical twins, those who are genetically identical, is compared to the behavioral similarity of fraternal twins, the ones that are not genetically identical. So as an example, identical twins are more similar to one another on measures of conduct problems. That would be an example of this. Note, though, that the environments of identical twins may be more similar, though, than fraternal twins, because the adults, they're going to stress the similarity between those two twins being exactly the same compared to fraternal twins that they know are not genetically identical. So it could be part of the environmental influence as well, those similarities that you're going to see. And so one of the things they'll do is look at adoption studies, and investigators seek to discover whether children that are adopted are more likely to have are they more like their adoptive parents, or are they more like their biological parents? Because that's going to give clues on which is more important, genes or environment. So the adoptive parents, they're providing that home environment, while the biological parents they contributed their genes. And then another form of adoption studies compares adoptive and biological siblings. On the hereditary environment correlations, this is really interesting. The idea that an individual's genes may influence the types of environments that they're exposed to. We normally think about the environment affecting the person, but the idea that the genes could actually kind of affect the environment, it's really interesting stuff. And one of these behavioral geneticists, her name's Scar, she described 3 ways that heredity and environment are correlated. I have figure 10 goes into this. So you have the passive, the evocative, and the active, the niche picking. For example, on the passive, if you have parents that are musically inclined, that they have those genes and they pass those genes on to the child, that child has inherited those genes to make them more musically inclined. And so they're going to go search out for more musically inclined environments, which is kind of interesting because I look behind me, I have instruments back here. I used to play these instruments. I don't really play them anymore, but one of the reasons I keep them out is so that if Leif would like to play them at some day, if they're around, maybe he'll consider playing them. So I expose him to the environment if he would like to try. That's the passive. The evocative, it talks about how a child that has an outgoing personality, that's happy and that smiles a lot, he is going to get more positive response from adults. And so those genes are affecting the type of environment that they're going to be exposed to. And Leif is another really good example of this. He's a handsome child, we'll put it that way. And he has a great big smile with these perfect teeth, and everybody just loves him. And so by him acting that way, he is getting all these positive responses from the environment, and that's going back and forth. People are like, oh, I like him because he's a nice, happy kid. He continues to be a nice, happy kid because people in the environment like him. So that's the evocative one. And on the niche picking, so kids that are more likely to be in athletics or musical instruments, reading, things like that, they are going to go out and try to find more of those activities. On these, they're framed in a positive way, but there can be negative things too. So if you have a kid that has a difficult personality and he's or she acts difficult, then the people around him or her are more likely to act negatively towards that child, and it can go like this. It's a bi-directional thing that's going on there, which is, it's sad. So that was on the heredity environment. On the shared and non-shared, what they're looking at here is the things that siblings experience. And so as siblings, you're going to experience your parents, they're going to have the same, intellectual orientation, probably the same SES, you're probably going to live in the same neighborhood. But the non-shared experiences, things that one of your siblings will experience but the other ones won't, those are going to be unique to the child. Each child, and they're not shared by the other sibling. As an example, for me and my sister, we are 8 years apart, and we grew up in completely different households because it was an 8-year gap there. If you only have 1 year apart, you're probably going to have a lot more of the same shared environment. But since we are 8 years apart, our environments were considerably different. Just as a small example, I think my parents divorced when I was 18. And so my sister was only 10. So I spent from 10 to 18 with married parents, but my sister, she spends from 10 to 18 with parents that are not married. All that being said, according to the text, the shared environment appears to account for very little of the variation in children's personality or interests, especially later on. Basically, what the research shows is that siblings are going to have different personalities, and they're just going to have those different personalities, and no effects are going to be able to change that. There's part of their personality that is going to be ingrained, is what a lot of the research shows. And so they might be under the same roof. They might have the same biological parents, but they are going to have different personalities because that's who they came out of the gate as, with those personalities. Longitudinal studies suggest that parenting or other environmental effects are stronger earlier in development than later. So what they mean by this is that by adolescence, or maybe even a little earlier, the child's own intelligence becomes more predictive than their mother's intelligence or the quality of the home environment. So yes, when a kid is very small, that environment's going to matter a lot. But once they get up to, 12, 14, whatever the age is there, a lot of it's going to be more on them and their genes and their development than it is going to be on the household. Something else is going to pop up later on is going to have a lot more to do with peers too, because you're going to be spending a lot more time with your peers when you're a teenager compared to spending more time with your parents. On the epigenetic view, on the next part here, or the gene-environment interaction, we've got a little taste of this for the article that I posted on inherited trauma. I have another little short video on that. I need to go find it, and I'll post it along with these videos where I talk about that article a little bit. On the epigenetic view, what they're saying here is development is a result of an ongoing bidirectional exchange between heredity and the environment. The interactions between your genes and the environment may involve specific DNA sequences. And so what they mean here is this gene-environment interaction is that you may have some genes that are turned on by an environment. That's kind of what that inherited trauma article was getting at. Another example of this, there is a short version of the genotype labeled 5-HTT-LPR. And so this gene is linked to depression, but it is only expressed with people, or it's more likely to be expressed with people that live extremely stressful lives. So you have this gene that's linked to depression, but if you live a somewhat normal life, that gene is not going to activate. But if you live in a very stressful situation, it could activate that gene, and now you're going to get depression. And so it's the genes and the environment working together to what's, again, turned on, turned up, etc. Psychological disorders. There are some that you can, if you experience early adversity, such as physical or sexual abuse, and if you have certain genes, that can turn on some type of disorder later on in life. The conclusions on this, the heredity-environment interaction, the emerging view right now, it's very complex. There's complex behaviors that are influenced by genes in a way that give people a propensity for a particular developmental trajectory. So if you have these genes, and then you have this environment, you're going to go this way. If you don't have those genes, but you have that environment, you could go the other way. And it's an interaction between those two things, like that 5-HTT-LPR. So development, what the point is, it's very complex. Again, 43,000 genes interacting with this environment. It's kind of another example. Let's say you have a kid and they have genes that are linked to aggression, but they grow up in this great house. They have great parents, great loving parents. So they go to great schools. They might not express that aggression or that violence because they grew up in this great household. Or maybe they will express those, genes of aggression in a socially acceptable way. For example, maybe that kid becomes a football player. And so in this culture, we think of being a football player as being socially acceptable. But let's say you take that same kid with those genes and you give them bad parents, neglectful parents, bad schools, a bad neighborhood, then there's definitely a potential for those genes to be expressed in a completely different way that is not going to be socially acceptable. And so that violence and aggression will come out in what we would consider a criminal type behaviors. And again, it kind of goes back to that idea of the range. You have this range where you're at, and that environment is going to help you to hone in on where your developmental trajectory is going to go. The text has a quote towards the end of the chapter. We are all creatures and creators of our world. So we are the products of our genetic legacy, but then we also have choices on the environment that we're going to expose ourselves to, or the environment that we're going to expose our kids to, and that those choices are going to guide our developmental trajectory or the path that we're going to go down. I'll put another little video on the inherited trauma. I'll go find that. And then also, you might consider getting your genes done. You could learn a lot about yourself. I have a short video on that where I've went over my genes personally. And so I'll try to get that video and put it together with this chapter. Thank you very much for listening.